So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Eva, who is a senior consultant at Agio and absolutely fantastic. So Eva, back to you.
All right. Thanks for that very nice introduction. Um, so I didn't really know what I was going to talk about initially when they solicited talks for InfoSeCon, but with COVID going rampant and everyone working from home, we got a lot of questions at our show about how incident response should be handled working from home. We also had several clients concerned about incidents and breaches with everyone working from home. And I had at least a couple of clients who actually had breaches after COVID and the work from home orders came. And so I thought this would still be a good topic. I know I've talked about incident response in the past. So this time we'll focus a little bit on incident response and how work from home has changed incident response and what you should maybe consider in terms of preparation, as we seem to be in a work from home state for the long haul. And I do believe that even if things get back to a relatively new normal, um, we may have increased work from home just because it seems to be working out okay, and we'll cut down on renting real estate for office space. So this may be something you can apply in the long term. So without further ado, let's get started. So here's the agenda. Again, normally I'll start with definition, best practices. We'll go into documentation and the various stages of incident response. And then at the end, I'm gonna cover penetration testing and risk assessments because we see an uptick in requests for more focused penetration and risk assessments, simply because work from home has shown some weaknesses and people want to focus not just on the generic assessments that they've done in the past, but want to have assessments that are a little bit more focused on work from home. I've had that in the past, and I still find this to be highly relevant because work from home has really brought out that humans are still something that needs to be considered a weak link. I'm not necessarily saying they are always the weakest link because I've seen some fairly badly patched environments, but humans definitely are a weak link. And with work from home, I think that has been made clear to a lot of organizations. So, definition, what is an incident? In ITIL, an incident is basically a service interruption. And that can be just a power outage, that can be something benign, like a user dropping coffee on their computer and that computer not being available to work on. An incident from a security perspective is usually something that affects CIA. So not necessarily always confidentiality, but certainly availability and integrity can cause incidents. If you have a possible reportable event with data being lost or unauthorized accessed, you may also then have a breach. One of the things, and we're going to cover that a little bit later on in the documentation, but I highly recommend that you tier your incidents because you don't want to bring out the full incident response team if it's just something like adware on a computer or a person potentially misplacing an encrypted USB drive. you don't really want to have all alarm bells go off because someone lost a USB drive, but there is no danger of it having institutional information on it. It's just their personal stuff, and it still comes in as a lost USB drive. So tiering your incidents is important because it will save resources. And I don't know of a single IT organization these days that has access resources either financially or in terms of staff. So tiering is one way that you can conserve resources. One thing I also want to point out, if you write your policies and you mention incident, it's important that everyone is clear on what an incident is. Um, it's okay for the CISO or the CIO or legal to define incident, but what's more important is that they all agree on what is an incident. You don't want to have arguments starting if there's a potential incident, what really is at stake now. So having a longer definition of an incident with additional information, such as which information is involved for it to be an incident, do we have to have confidentiality impacted, or can it also be availability or integrity only? Do that homework before and have that written in policy. I just did a recent tabletop exercise where rather than have a policy available, some of these definitions were discussed in email, which is great that you have discussions. And email is the way to go these days because you can't meet in person. But you don't really want to rely on an email chain to define whether you have an incident or a breach or it's just a security event. The other thing that tiering helps with is it can help defining who acts, because some of the items, especially the lower level incidents, can potentially be sorted out by the help desk. And it doesn't need to go to a level 3, which in many cases is the security office. So having tiers in place, again, can conserve resources and also save what is in many cases your most precious resource, the level 3 support. And then the other thing is who is responsible. This is something that I cover a lot and stress a lot in tabletop exercises, because I want to make sure that the escalation points are clear and that the people that do the operational cleanup, containment, that they know exactly who they need to escalate to and when they need to escalate to. You don't want to have shouting matches while you handle an incident because someone feels they should have been notified sooner, or someone feels they are in charge while someone else feels that they have better understanding. So in a lot of cases, it's along the lines of, well, you're going to handle the initial response because you're on call, and that's fine. But if you are a junior member of the security team who normally does not handle firewalls or has only limited experience with logs, the incident handling may be impacted because you just don't have the experience. So in many cases, I would advise you to say, yes, the on-call person is the one that gets the initial alert. But if it's, or they truly suspect it's an incident, then there should be an understanding that everyone should be reachable and should be available to jump in and help. I remember years ago, I had just been, I think, on call maybe a month. And I got an alert, of course, 2 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday. What better time? And it said all the IPSs were just beeping like crazy. And I was on the phone with the Security Operations Center and asking for additional information. It took us about 2 hours to sort out what actually happened. That had never happened before, and the reason that had never happened before was because we had gotten a new tool. Someone had made a mistake using that tool and had triggered all the IPSs. Not going to go into any more detail what that was. It was a really stupid mistake that had happened. But during those initial 2 hours, I had tried to call two of my colleagues who were more experienced in network security, and actually one of whom handled the IPSs where I had never touched them up to that point and couldn't reach either one of them. Thank goodness it was not a true incident, but it certainly was not a pleasant situation I was in that Sunday morning. And it turned out that when we discussed the follow-up to that incident, they didn't think they could have done anything other than what I ended up doing, nor did they think they would have been much faster than me figuring out what was going on. But it certainly would have made me feel better if I had a more experienced person on my side during that initial 2 hours. So again, I think the escalation point needs to be clear. Who decides when, for example, to involve legal needs to be clear. Who does the external communication needs to be clear. But from an operations perspective, I don't think you should take the approach that, you're on call, too bad, it's your incident, you handle it. It should be all hands on deck if necessary, even if it turns out, like in my case, to be a stupid mistake. Because if it had not been a mistake, it certainly would have taken us 2 hours to figure out what was going on. And in case of an incident, that was 2 hours where we had potentially a compromise on site. So again, that's just based on my experience, that's my recommendation. So these are the best practices as SANS lists them. You start with preparation that is always ongoing. You have identification. Is it an incident? What are we dealing with? You try to contain it. Once it's contained, you work on eradication. Then you start your discovery. And for me, the most important part is actually a lesson learned. And I advise that the lesson learned should be in writing. And if possible, you can keep it as a ticket, but it should be written down. And the reason I advise it should be written down is not only will it help with risk assessments and prioritizing where you need to invest potentially, but when it comes time to redo your incident response procedure and your incident response policy, it can also help to look at lessons learned and identify potential weaknesses that can be remedied with training, additional resources in that area, whether they are human or technical, as well as pointing out what we see a lot still, and I think that's one of the biggest weaknesses, are communication gaps. And if you can tailor, for example, a tabletop exercise to point to those existing communication gaps and work on them, the incident response in the future is going to be a lot smoother. So far, we have not touched on COVID. Now we have COVID. I've worked from home from before COVID. So COVID really hasn't changed much for me. The only thing that has changed is I don't travel to client sites anymore. Again, not a major change for me. My dog would disagree. My dog is now totally spoiled. He was only a tad spoiled before. He's now totally spoiled. He expects me to be available for him now 24/7 because I'm just around all the time now. I don't travel anymore. So why do I think I have the right to go to the grocery store by myself? I need to take him along. So that's the only change that I've experienced. I now have a teenage dog who throws tantrums. But work from home for a lot of people has meant significant changes. we now have people that have to possibly share computers, even if you get a computer from your organization to take home and work from home. You may have that computer in a location where your children can access it. And having worked at an organization where I used to handle a lot of copyright infringement, I know that dad's computer was often used in those cases too to download some stuff. And then dad had to explain that he was really not interested in that latest movie or whatever was downloaded. And that was probably his teenage son. So that's one of the issues is you have work from home, you have shared space with your kids, possibly other relatives. How secure are those devices? Not just against kids downloading stuff, but in general, kids going to a website and possibly picking up malware. I also have clients that had mostly workstations. So work from home means that the staff is actually working on personal devices. So that brings up the issue of now we have an incident involving a personal device. What can you do with that device? Well, you can't touch it because it's not your device. You as an organization cannot just tell your staff member, bring in the device, we need to look at it because we think it may have some malware on it. That's really up to the person who owns the device, which is your staff member, to handle that malware. So I had other organizations that when the stay home order came down, spent money at times using personal credit cards because the purchase order hadn't come in to make sure that at least all the IT people had company issued devices. They were then sorted out later on for reimbursement. So we have to now deal with a mixed environment where some people may have personal devices, other people have company issue devices. One of the biggest changes is probably a timeline adjustment. I just dealt with a tabletop where the determination was made that you need to drive into the office to be at the server when you restore it because you can't do it remotely. That may be fine if you're 5 or 10 minutes away, but in some areas in North Carolina, especially rural areas, you may have a 30 to 45-minute drive. So now we're dealing with the incident response being, rather than go across the hall to the server room and unblock the server or do whatever you need to do on that device, now you need to drive in 30 to 40 minutes, and then you can do whatever you need to do. So timelines need to be adjusted. I'm giving this presentation over Zoom. In the past, I usually was present in person. So now we have the whole war room discussion over Zoom. That brings up issues of, just in general, people not muting themselves, people speaking on mute, the usual things we all have experience with Zoom. So the discussions are going to be a little bit more cumbersome than they have been in the past if we have Zoom available. And if it's a phone, then people tend to talk over each other. Again, we need to make allowances for all of that. One thing, and again, I'm going to cover the penetration testing and security risk assessment later on, but we have had VPNs be a nice target. VPN credentials were always a desirable target. They now have become an even bigger target together with Citrix and all the remote access technology. Because not only are they now the lifeline to actually get work done, but they are now rolled out to a lot more users than they have in the past, which means that attackers can possibly target a wider user base to see whether vulnerabilities can be exploited. And we all had enough vulnerabilities. Do I need to mention Citrix? That was a major vulnerability. So we need to reassess what are our desired targets. Certainly, all the remote connection tools are now getting more important than they were in the past. Um, and then we need to also consider that the other tools that we rely on, like Zoom, has had its security issues. The whole infrastructure that we now use, we may need to adjust what we consider important and how we prioritize patching and handling a lot of those tools. And then logging. Um, I know we have in the past done some logging for VPN to be able to monitor if a VPN account was used in very short time with logins from different countries. But now you may have to adjust logging to handle your new precious remote access tools. So a lot of these things may need to be adjusted. And that's why I'm going to cover the risk assessment later on and what to watch out for. Again, this I had covered in the past. I do recommend to have an incident response policy and a procedure. The policy should be for everyone. It should have that tiered incident matrix. Usually I go with level 1, 2, 3, with 1 being just a random, adware incident or maybe an interruption where someone can't log into a device. But there is no risk to institutional information, with level 3 being a high risk that institutional information has been compromised, and level 2 being some kind of malware, but uncertain whether institutional information is even involved. So those would be the 3 tiers. The policy should be written simple enough that everyone can follow the instructions about what to do during an incident. I still advise that if you're a staff member outside of IT and you suspect an incident, you should have a number. You should call that number and wait for instructions. Even if your antivirus indicates there may be malware, I would not run the malware scan. I would not do anything on my computer until IT has said, yes, run the scan. I normally, when I draft incident response policies, spell out that you should not try to resolve the incident on your own. You should wait for instructions from IT. Simply because I don't want, if there is truly an incident at stake with a possible breach, I don't want to make the work for the IT staff more difficult by first sorting out whether something was done by the user or the attacker. So again, keep it simple, 1 to 2 pages of incident response policy, nothing more needed, and then have clear instructions to staff that the first action should be to call IT and wait for instructions. Whether that's a help desk or the security office, that's really up to you as an organization. But to me, that's the most important part, is prevent the regular user from making any changes that could cause damage to the incident response process. The procedure is, in my opinion, a document that I would not post publicly. I would keep that restricted to incident response staff, legal involved, of course, whoever is part of the CERT team. It should have significant detail, a lot of it in terms of scenarios. So for example, that scenario I mentioned early on, where I was woken up early in the morning on a Sunday, that would be a good cause to write that scenario down as a future part of the incident response procedure, simply because it happened once. Chances are someone is going to make that mistake again. Who may remember 5 years later that this happened 5 years ago? Maybe no one, maybe someone. but if you believe in my kind of luck, probably not the person that gets woken up after 5 years. So they will have to reinvent the wheel again. So rather than do that, have that written down as a procedure, explain the scenario and what was done to resolve it. That would be a good scenario to use. And the scenario part of the incident response procedure should really be a living document that gets amended as new incidents occur, because that way every new member of the CERT can read through that document and learn, and the institutional knowledge is actually put down on paper rather than in the brains of the people that are near retirement and 5 years from now may not be around anymore. So it's important that that kind of institutional knowledge about what worked, what didn't work is actually put down on paper. I also recommend that you have some few basic forms, usually a chain of evidence forms, maybe also a basic agreement for a third party to start forensic services. Chain of evidence form is a good thing to have because you don't always control the time that you need it. I had a client where the FBI showed up one day and demanded a hard drive because they had seen that the device was talking to the same IP than another device they were working on for a case. So they decided to just pull the hard drive. So my client was surprised by a Friday afternoon visit from the FBI. If you have a chain of evidence form available, it makes sense to have that ready just for these kinds of visits. In many cases, you determine when you need it, but in some cases, you may not have a lot of an option. The communication procedure, in my opinion, is crucial because that's the one thing that's really hard to practice. So I usually recommend that the communication procedure have contact information for the FBI, your insurance carrier if you have one, and any vendor that you may need. I have dealt several tabletop exercises where maybe only one person knew who the contact was for a certain vendor. And then I usually say, okay, let's assume that person is now on a cruise in the Caribbean and you need to get a hold of that vendor. And then the problem starts because we first need to figure out who's the point of contact at the vendor and how do we reach that vendor. So those are the kinds of contact informations you want to have in there. The more what I call the soft procedural aspects that you want to have in a communication procedure are who determines when you make a note to the outside, if you have stakeholders, who controls that communication, who will deal with local law enforcement if they need to get involved, or with the media. I also recommend that as part of the communication procedure, you have possible language ready that the help desk or your marketing department can use to put on websites or give to people that call into the help desk with issues. For example, we've seen some recent ransomware attacks where whole networks were down. So one of the things I recommend is that you have language available that if you still have phones and people call in because they can't connect to the network, that the help desk can actually use, or that can be put on a website if you have an external website that is still accessible, just to keep everyone informed about what is going on. So again, communication procedure is now much more critical. In work from home procedures, if you have the network down, you have people possibly in several counties that are wondering why they can't connect. What I recommend is that personal cell phones be available and that information be stored at least with managers so they can contact their staff and inform them what is going on. I keep doing a lot of tabletops involving ransomware recently. A lot of them want to deal with a worst case scenario. All of the network is down and the phones are down, which means no VoIP phones. You have people working from home, so you need the personal phones to actually get a hold of them. So keep updated contact information available for everyone in your group. That's critical. If you don't have that, you're going to have a hard time reaching out to people. I cannot stress enough that you need clear-cut escalation processes because you don't want to start arguing about what is next during the incident. Again, technical staff that may have to help with an incident, whether it's in a clinical unit that may have to come in and do manual work rather than rely on computers, or whether it's IT staff that needs to be available. That has to be now 24/7. And you also want to make sure that every member of your incident response team has at least one backup. Um, people still go on vacation, people switch jobs. That institutional knowledge, hopefully it's all in paper form, but in many cases, I don't think it's all in paper form. So you want to make sure that you have backups for every role on your cert. And then you want to have vendors, again, document the contact information of the vendors. If they need remote access, make sure that's documented so you know whether they can actually help you or not. And then make sure you clarify access controls. One of the things I tend to do a lot these days is incident response tabletops where Active Directory is out. So now Active Directory is out, you may have stuff in the cloud that's secure, but how are you going to access it if you don't have access, if you don't have Active Directory? So we do a lot of tabletops where we plan on not having Active Directory available, and then we need to figure out what still can be accessed and how can we access things. And again, rearrange your priorities. Simply because you've been with that vendor for 10 years doesn't mean that if it's a regional outage, that vendor is going to consider you their most and dearest client. You may be number 15 out of God knows how many clients need help from that vendor, so be prepared to wait. Ideally, you have an SLA in place where the vendor can be held accountable to assist you within a certain amount of time, excluding possibly things like earthquakes and other natural disasters. But that's something for you to work out with the vendor, but work that out before the incident occurs and not while you're struggling with the incident. So this is what I spend a lot of time with these days, are preparation, incident response tabletops. We do two kinds. We do operational and executive. The executive is clearly high level, and the emphasis there is all about escalation. Who is responsible for what? Do the people that need to cooperate actually play nice with each other? Not always a given. The scenario selection, you can use the same scenarios for both kinds. There is no reason to not use, for example, ransomware with executives. Executives may be surprised that all of a sudden phones are out and the network is down. And they may have to work from home and have to rely on cell phones to get a hold of people. They may learn that there are some weaknesses that they have not considered or did not consider high priority. I had a tabletop where the CFO learned that full disk encryption not being funded for 2 years meant that he had to notify every single one of his clients that there was a breach. And lo and behold, within 6 months, funding for full disk encryption of laptops was available. So those are the kinds of discoveries that executive may make during a tabletop exercise. So I know a lot of people may think that operational tabletops are more fruitful. but let me tell you, executive tabletops can be very informative to the executives and can bring about changes you have been waiting for a long time. Excuse me. Then again, who needs to be involved? One of the things I recommend is that legal be part of the operational tabletop, for the simple reason that I get a lot of operational tabletops where a frequent response will be, oh, we'll run it by legal and they make the decision. And I keep asking, is legal prepared for it? Oh yeah. Until you do the executive tabletop and you realize that legal was like, well, we need more information. We are not ready to make that decision based on this information. So normally for operational tabletop, we of course want everyone from the CERT to be present. I also like to have help desk staff available because in many cases they will have to deal with other people calling in and trying to figure out what's going on. If you have someone from marketing present, that doesn't hurt either. And then, like I said, legal, I really like to have present. Not required, but also for some clients certainly recommended is having some third parties present. If you have a vendor that is critical for all your backups and maybe handles your disaster recovery, you may want to have that vendor present during some of your tabletops also. In addition, if you work closely with law enforcement or your local emergency response for support, especially in a hospital case, it may not hurt to have them attend maybe one or two of your tabletops over the years so that you can figure out that the collaboration between the hospital and the local emergency response is working out well, and every group is aware of their responsibilities. So I highly encourage, especially if they can just be available now with Zoom on the phone or via Zoom, even for 5 or 10 minutes, just to make sure that everyone is aware of the responsibilities and how people interact with each other. That's usually helpful. And then, of course, we have follow-up actions. We usually present, if I do a tabletop, clients get a report, and then we have rooms for improvement, and we can usually discuss, I usually discuss with my clients any areas of improvement that I see during the tabletop right away. So, are there any questions so far?
We do have one anonymous attendee who asked, when dealing with cybersecurity insurance policy providers, how often do you see issues with obtaining funds? And what types of issues are most common in these situations?
Okay, so I have a number of clients that have insurance coverage. One of them I just came across is very good. I think they're doing all the right things and expect the client to jump through a bunch of hoops to be ready. The one area I've seen issues with is, so first of all, get the insurance coverage can be tricky because they require you to do your homework. The insurance coverage, of course, only wants to extend that coverage if you are what looks like a low risk to them and you are reasonably prepared. So documentation, procedures, all of those things usually are a requirement to just get coverage. They will also then often require you to select providers such as attorneys, forensic companies from a list of approved clients. So you don't necessarily have a choice. In addition, simply because you have a third party handling, for example, your logging and your network security, doesn't mean that that same third party is then able to assist you, so to speak, during incidents. So a lot of the insurance coverage depends on meeting the company's requirements, which can be quite stringent. The one area that I've seen an issue with getting actually coverage was with ransomware, because especially with a lot of foreign entities and nation state being involved in cyber incidents, I know ransomware at some point was possibly considered an act of war. Um, and you can make the case that attacking infrastructure installation, and possibly right now what we see with healthcare organizations, that goes beyond just an attack on a private organization, but actually goes against national interests of the US. Um, but that certainly in some instances, there was an argument where ransomware was not going to get covered. Um, I'm not sure that's the case for every insurance cover, but that was one area where I've seen issues in the past. But in general, what I can point out is, even if you get a very good insurance company, you need to have your ducks in a row too before they even extend your coverage. So again, policies, procedures, documentation, workflows, they all need to be in place. Basic security best practices, controls, technical controls need to be in place, and then be prepared that if you sign up with the insurance carrier, you have to abide and select from their list of vendors to help you during an incident. So that choice may not be yours anymore. So it's worthwhile to do your homework before you sign up for insurance coverage.
Okay, and then we have in the actual chat, Sid has asked, would you disconnect or shut down if IT isn't responding fast enough? Which of course, fast enough seems to be very subjective.
So normally I recommend to avoid shutting down a computer because you lose the ability to do memory forensics. If, of course, you have data being exfiltrated and you can't block the data from leaving your network some other way, you may have to shut down. With ransomware, I do advise my clients to be ready to cut the network and segment it by force if necessary, even if it means pulling the plug and shutting networks down. I just read this morning an incident from one of the hospitals where they tried to catch it early enough, but it wasn't caught in time, and ransomware was encrypting a good number of machines with downtime expected to be several days. Not interrupting patient care, but still without IT support for a number of days. So I think depending on the aggressive nature of the ransomware, you may have to shut computers down, but that is a decision, again, that the CERT should make, and it should be clear who on the CERT, or if an external executive needs to make that decision to shut the network down. It should also be written into some form of policy. Normally in the acceptable use policy, any disruptive computer, I recommend it's written that can be disconnected. If it's disrupting the network, either sending out spam or in some other ways obviously compromised, that IT has the right to disconnect it, doesn't have to wait for the system owner to say yes. But again, that should be written in a policy well and thought through well before the incident happened. So again, my recommendation, if you can, leave the machine up, disconnect it from the network, but leave it up so you can get memory forensics. If you have to shut machines down and maybe cut off VLANs because of ransomware and it's spreading fast enough, then do that. If a user can't get hold of IT, then we have a bigger issue, because normally IT should have a response time of a few minutes. Normally we working, if a critical ticket came in, we were working off an SLA of 15 minutes. So within 15 minutes, you should get a hold of someone from IT. If it takes longer, then I would recommend to revisit the SLA for incident response in your organization.
Okay, and then we have anonymous attendee in the question and answer section. Is it sufficient within some EDR tools to isolate, quote unquote, the machine rather than shutting down, parentheses, shades of the penalty box? You may have answered this, but
Yeah, so we used to have a penalty VLAN also where we put machines that were offending, quote unquote. Um, so that may be one way. What you need to really weigh up is the risk of exfiltrating and losing important, possibly sensitive information um, the bigger risk, or can you safely isolate the machine? So if you have a tool where you can isolate the machine so you don't lose the data to some foreign IP, then that is advisable, simply because you don't want to make changes and you don't want to disrupt the processes that are running because you can get important information from these processes. Memory forensics is its own little beast. And if you have not done it, chances are you're not going to start doing it during an incident. So again, that is something you need to discuss before the incident occurs. I would encourage you to think about that and possibly get a third party on retainer that is able to do memory forensics and find out from them some of the baselines that they want in place in order to do that. And that should also inform your decision. Any other questions?
yeah, well, we have two more, it looks like. One says, again, by the anonymous attendee, would recommend getting forensic team contract and legal team contract signed and agreed to prior to an incident. Some insurance will give you free 72 hours of coverage in addition to your deductible, but if you are large and it takes time to get contract signed, you may have just burned lots of money. Guess that's more of a comment than a question.
Yeah.
Okay, and then for account takeover beyond resetting passphrases and invalidating tokens, should the account or accounts be locked until further time?
Yeah, so if someone has compromised an account and you can't get a hold of the user, what I would recommend is lock the account and then find out from the user what may have happened until you do your investigation and actually get a hold of the user. The one thing that's clear is you don't want the user to just reset their password from a possibly compromised machine. So for that, it's usually advisable to lock the account, prevent it from sending out spam or whatever is happening, and then discuss with the user what happened unless you have already identified how it got compromised, because you don't really want to have the user keep trying to reset an account from a machine that was compromised, and it just will prolong the incident. Okay, I still got a few slides, so I'm gonna.
Okay, there are no more open questions and we are at the 10-minute mark.
Yep. So let me go here. So again, we covered containment, the role of the help desk, be clear where you need to drop off computers. Um, expect the staff to be ready to drive either to a central location to drop off the computer if you have minimal help desk staff, and then be clear what to do with personal devices. I do not recommend to simply grab a personal device from a user. That's a big no-no. Then we covered logging, baseline configuration. Again, you may want to up some of the controls, maybe do a scan more often with remote work, just to be safe that you consider a malware incident soon enough. And in some cases, in order for the malware to actually be caught on a remote workstation, they may have to connect to the network. So you may have rules in place where I know we had rules in place that once a month people had to VPN in so that logs could be updated, because otherwise we would never find out if there was an incident. So that may be things you need to consider also. In the cloud, really nothing has changed from COVID, other than you may need to consider if your Active Directory is out and you have Active Directory authentication into the cloud, how you're going to connect to the cloud. We used to have backdoors in place, not NSA sanctioned backdoors, but backdoors that we could access in an emergency, everything without Active Directory. That may be something also to consider to put that in place. And again, from a logging perspective with AWS, make sure you're familiar with what the logs look like and you have the appropriate logging and service levels in place. You don't want to realize during an incident that the logs are not that easy to read in your version and are not as nicely displayed. And for a few dollars more, you could have gotten a lot better log capability. Lessons learned. We kind of covered this. So this is the last two items I want to cover. We see a lot of requests now for focused penetration tests. So rather than do a penetration test on your whole network, we see requests for penetration test on the remote infrastructure. And that's something to consider, especially if, as I mentioned in the beginning, that people may continue to work from home in larger numbers. And so you may need to have your remote infrastructure secure. Unfortunately, this has been a really bad year for remote logins. We had Citrix vulnerabilities, and now we have an MSNet logon. So you may also want to look at your timelines and prioritize some of the patching to be meeting the work from home reality. As always, anything public facing should be patched immediately if it's critical or high. And make sure that your remote technologies are secure and are up to the task of having a lot of people log in at the same time. Wasted Locker was one of the malware that actually made the rounds earlier and actually was using compromises through social engineering of select users to then hit the network and start encrypting devices. So make sure that your remote users are aware. Security awareness training must continue. I have advised all my healthcare clients with the latest threats against healthcare and ransomware to really stress user awareness and send reminders out to their users again to be careful about unsolicited emails or phone calls. Anything that they don't expect that is out of the normal should be treated as suspicious. And then security risk assessments, again, if you have a corrective action plan in place, you may have to reprioritize some of the items. Maybe your remote infrastructure wasn't as important before. It's probably more important now. So maybe funds need to be allocated to that. I recommend that if you have the funds to do an SRA focused on COVID, which means that you focus on work from home changes. That SRA can be limited to remote technology, how staff training is doing, documentation, workflows, monitoring, and timelines and priorities. So this would be something that may actually be cheaper than a full-blown SRA because it's very focused. But with having reached what I would call a new normal right now, this may be a good time to do a risk assessment and have a third party look at how you handle your work from home and whether you have all the best practices in place or maybe if there's room for improvement. COVID will stay with us, and this is me talking as a public health masters now. COVID will stay with us probably for another year. I don't expect that once we have the vaccine, it's going to go away overnight. So we may be talking about COVID still next year around this time, even with the vaccine rolled out. So I encourage everyone to be ready, and risk assessments and penetration tests are actually what I would consider also part of the preparation for incident response. And Bruce Schneier again. And any more questions? We got 4 more minutes.
Q&A is currently empty.
Good.
Sid did ask, how do you make certain the device is cleared of all info prior to decommissioning?
How do you make sure it's okay? So if you choose to decommission, and I leave that up to the organization. I have in the past recommended that if the device is old enough, to just throw some nails into the hard drive and throw it away. If you want to decommission it, there are Department of Defense standard override software that you can use, and that will get rid of all the data. I usually recommend that you look into Department of Defense sanctioned software for erasing all the data, and that will make sure that the data is gone. I would still recommend that you continue to encrypt that device.